Well, I'm setting out on a journey and you'd be most welcome to come along. As you can see, I'm in an area that's as famous for its dark caverns as it is for its breathtaking hilltops. But the journey that I'm setting out on is through the equally dark and breathtaking legends, facts and myths that surround the ancient Castleton Garland ceremony. And in this realm we'll encounter Celts and Romans, green men and rush bearers, kings and pretenders, as well as village doctors, bell ringers, school teachers and an innkeeper's daughter-in-law as we reveal the forgotten history of a unique calendar custom and fill in the gaps in what is a truly fascinating story. Castleton is a noted place for its ringing, singing and playing. Mrs. Eyre told me that the 29th of May is known as Garland Day, and from further inquiries that I've made of the inhabitants, I have no doubt that such is the fact. Sidney Oldall Addy stayed here in Mrs. Eyre's guest house when he came to Castleton in 1901. He was a solicitor and he had a practice in Sheffield, but he was also an antiquarian and a member of the Folklore Society. Now, with the advent of the 20th century and the recent death of Victoria, old traditions like the Castleton Garland ceremony were coming under ever increasing pressure to either modernise or else accept that they were now things of the past. So he was keen to see and write about this ancient calendar custom before its inevitable demise. But, as you can see, against all the odds, it survived. And Addy's paper, which was published in the Folklore Society's 1901 journal, is now an important landmark in the story of the origins and survival of the Castleton Garland ceremony. Whatever the season, whatever the weather, if you're here on a flying visit or looking for an in-depth adventure, cheering or chasing, this end of the Hope Valley's got everything, and just about everybody's been to Castleton at some time or other. But probably not on a weekday evening in late May, which is when the Garland ceremony tends to happen. So, although everyone's welcome, it's mainly people with a local connection who you'll see here following the procession as it snakes through the village. The garland making starts around lunchtime, and you can see the villagers bringing flowers to decorate the main garland and the smaller queen posy. In recent years, the making was done under the covered area behind the visitor centre. But as you can see, it's been redeveloped. So the garland makers have redeployed across the road to the garage workshop, an example of how traditions have to be flexible in order to survive. Just as the garland makers have to be ready to create their floral art from whatever flowers the season's weather has provided. At 4 o'clock, the maypole gets put up in the marketplace, and an hour later, the Garland King and his consort begin their warm-up walk and ride through the parts of the village where the main parade doesn't go. That starts at 6:30 from one of Castleton's 6 hostelries. The pubs take it in turn to be the gathering point where the dancers meet up with the king, the consort and the band to begin their processional dance or Morris walk all the way to the village's eastern boundary at Spittal. Here they pause to gather their breath before the Garland King leads them back to the first pub, the Cheshire Cheese, where the children perform a country dance with circle and chain steps. Since 2014, boys as well as girls have been allowed to dance. And when the music stops, both they and the band, along with the king and consort, get to wet their whistles. The same happens outside all of the other pubs, but when they get to the last one, the George, the king leaves the dancers and rides up to the base of the church tower. Later there'll be maypole dancing and a moment of remembrance when the Queen Posy is laid on the war memorial. But first, the main Garland gets hoisted to the top of the tower to sit on the central pinnacle, surrounded by branches of oak which have been put there the night before. This ties in with the fact that everyone in the village is sporting a sprig of oak, in recognition that the young Charles II had escaped from the Roundheads by hiding in an oak tree. And they're doing it today because Garland Day, May the 29th, was once a public holiday, and it was known as Oak Apple Day or Royal Oak Day, or originally Restoration Day, because it celebrated the restoration of the monarchy back in 1660. That's why the king and consort are dressed in 17th century costume, and why some people have assumed that the Garland ceremony is simply a celebration of Charles II being restored to the throne. But in this video I'm going to show you why I think that there's a richer and more colourful heritage in the forgotten history of this unique and ancient ceremony. Castleton's ancient Garland ceremony is now unique, and its survival must be down to the willingness of the local community to adapt to change to keep the tradition alive. To see what happens when that isn't the case, I've come to this village in Dorset, where another Garland ceremony has only recently died out. The Abbotsbury Garland was associated with the local mackerel fishery, but the last of the boats of the fishing fleet that used to work off Chesil Beach were finally tied up in the 1950s, and the garlands that were traditionally cast upon the waters were, in recent years, placed on the war memorial. But the ceremony remained associated with the old fisher families, and although it was their grandchildren who paraded the garland through the village, as the old folk faded away, so too did the tradition, because it wasn't taken up by the incomers who now live in this picture postcard village. Now, in Castleton, it used to be the bell ringers who organised the Garland ceremony, but at the beginning of the Second World War, a committee of villagers took over. So, if anything, the connection between the Garland and the local community was strengthened. And its uniqueness helped to attract the local press and folklore scholars. So, since then, the Garland's been well documented. But discovering what happened before 1901, when Addy produced the first academic report on the Garland, involves looking to see what's known about other traditional activities, to see if they can give us any clues about the origins of the Castleton Garland. Needless to say, we don't know when the Garland ceremony actually started, but it must have been before Victoria came to the throne, because Addy interviewed an 84-year-old Castleton resident called Samuel Marrison. He had been born in 1817, and he said that the Garland Day was much the same as he remembered it from when he was a child, except that back in those far-off days, the band used to play woodwind instruments. Now, for me, that particular detail lends credibility to his recollection, because brass instruments and consequently brass bands only became popular in the 1830s. But clearly, some elements of the Garland ceremony are much older than that, and although we don't have any proof, there are many who believe that people in this area have been celebrating the arrival of spring with floral tributes or garlands since the dawn of history.
My name is Peter Harrison, and I am the chairman of Castleton Historical Society, and the origin of Castleton Garland Day to some extent is lost in the mists of time. But we could suggest that it started about 1000 BC.
2 metre is 41.
Looking at these 21st century excavations,
reminds me that 50 years ago, when I was a student, I worked at the Manchester University training excavations up on Man Tor. We were investigating these massive earthworks, which we were able to establish were part of a hill fort, which also served to protect the settlers who lived and farmed down here in the Hope Valley. Later, when I was working at Manchester Museum, I was involved in the identification of this, the Castleton stone head.
The head was found about 50 yards or so from the russet well that comes up at the rate of about 2,000 gallons a minute.
Well, it would have been a particular interest in the Iron Age, I should think. Any old spring, they saw water as being liminal.
The tradition is about pagan rites and fertility and the spring and wanting the blessing of the gods.
By their nature, stone heads are very, very difficult to date. However, the style of the Castleton head, in particular the depiction of certain features, suggests that this head is indeed ancient.
You'll notice that one eye is winking and it's got very sensuous lips and apparently hair down the sides, all carved out of this stone.
If this is the case, then this head probably formed part of a shrine, at which the local Iron Age farmers made offerings of the new season's flowers when they felt the need for divine intervention in their everyday lives.
Christian traditions adopted some of the pagan rituals and brought it into Christianity, so adaptation rather than conflict.
So it is possible that the floral garland may well have its roots in activities dating from the pre-Christian era, and that the Castleton head itself is a rare, tangible relic from that time.
Moving the story forward from the Iron Age to the Middle Ages involves the church. Here in St Edmunds, this annual Christmas tree festival reminds us how the early Christians turned many of the old pagan festivities into their own, in this case turning Yuletide into Christmas. And we still sing about decorating or decking the halls with boughs of holly. Now, at other times of the year, decking your house with branches of greenery, putting boughs over the door, was a sure way to protect all those inside from witches. And it was also a traditional way to mark the arrival of spring. And, as we've heard, floral garlands were used to decorate the pre-Reformation churches when the new season's blooms appeared every May. Now, the supercharged medieval equivalent of the vicarage coffee morning was called a church ale, which unsurprisingly involved the whole congregation getting together over a few flagons of ale. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in Castleton, but from records from around the country, we believe that the Whitsun ale was the biggest of these occasions, and some communities also elected a Lord of Misrule. Now, he was just one of the villagers who was chosen from among their number, and for that one day he was in charge, so he could declare what happened. And inevitably, the Lord of Misrule game turned into a drinking binge, and things got pretty raucous. Now, after the Reformation, the Church of England bishops frowned on this sort of activity, and then later still, in the 17th century, when Cromwell was in charge, the Puritans put a complete stop to them. They also got rid of all forms of ritual and ceremony from the church services, and they put an end to all forms of traditional merrymaking, including that of bringing May garlands into church. This dour state of affairs lasted until after Cromwell's death, when in 1660 Parliament invited Charles II to return to England from exile and to be restored to the throne.
And when he rode into London on May the 29th, 1660, it was like New Year's Day. A coronation and the Olympics all rolled into one, and the nation celebrated. The Church of England added a service of thanksgiving to its calendar, and Parliament ordered that May the 29th would henceforth be a public holiday, known as Restoration Day. And of course, all those Puritan restrictions on merrymaking were lifted, and throughout the country they revived their old traditional festivities. Now, in many places, they moved some or all of their May Day ceremonies to this new holiday at the end of the month, so that the weather would be warmer and they'd have more flowers available for making garlands. And that's why people think that this ceremony must relate back to the time of Charles II and his restoration. Now, I don't know of any documents that relate specifically to what was happening in Castleton at that time. But diaries and the like from other parts of the country, most famously by Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn, only mention bonfire celebrations and church services on May the 29th, both of which, incidentally, tailed off after the honeymoon period at the start of Charles's 25-year reign. Now, after his death, the monarchy became embroiled in religion and politics, and the Stuarts, who were Catholics, eventually lost out to the Protestant Hanoverians. In 1714, George I became king at the invitation of Parliament, so he had the support of the Whig Party and the majority of the population. But a large minority, mainly Catholics and Tories, believed that the Stuarts had a divine right to the throne, so the exiled James Edward Stuart, the Jacobite Old Pretender, was the man who they recognised as being king. Now, these armchair Jacobites quite understandably didn't want another civil war, but they could show their true colours every May the 29th, because by drinking a toast to the restoration of the Stuart monarchy back in 1660, they were in fact showing that they were in support of James Stuart overthrowing King George. And that's why during the 1720s, 30s and 40s, any celebrations of the Restoration on May the 29th were seen as tantamount to treason. The Jacobite rebellion came to a head in 1745 when Bonnie Prince Charlie led an army of clansmen and foreign mercenaries from the Scottish Highlands down towards London, where he was intent on deposing King George and claiming the throne for his father, James Edward Stuart. But his luck was about to change. The rebels got as far south as Derby without meeting any serious resistance, but when they heard that a large government army was nearby, they took stock and then retreated back to Scotland. This annual reenactment culminates at Derby's statue of Bonnie Prince Charlie. His retreat from here was the beginning of the end for the rebels, and although he survived the following year's defeat at Culloden, he was a broken man, and the Jacobite cause faded into history. Now, some people believe that because Castleton had had royalist sympathies during the Civil War, it would have continued supporting the Stuarts during the Jacobite rebellion, but I haven't found any evidence to support such a theory. So it's not surprising that when Castleton got news of the retreat of the Jacobite army in December 1745, just like everywhere else in the country, they rang the church bells in celebration. And that all adds to my belief that Castleton wouldn't have been doing anything to celebrate a Stuart monarch during the Jacobite period. Now, of course, that wouldn't have stopped them from carrying out traditional May Day celebrations on either May the 1st or the 29th. And of course, that would include bringing into church traditional May Day garlands, just like they'd done before those Puritan restrictions came into force. So, for that reason, I think that this other entry that's been transcribed from the Churchwarden's accounts for 1749 about a rod to hang the garland on refers to a traditional garland made by the ringers, even though some of the versions say it's the singers. But we'll never know which group it was because the original accounts book has been lost. However, there is one aspect of the Garland ceremony which, along with the day it happens on, does go back to 1660 and Charles II. Or does it? Oak, which everyone wears for the ceremony, did become symbolic of the Stuarts at the time of the Restoration. But in the early 18th century, the wearing of oak on May the 29th was made toxic by the rebel Jacobites, and it wasn't revived until the 1760s, when it became a symbol of support for a popular new king, the first of the Georges, who was a true-born Englishman. So you could argue that it's not Charles II, but really it should be this king who the Garland ceremony ought to be celebrating.